All right, welcome everybody. I am here with Clyde Rathbone of Letterwiki. Letterwiki is a platform where people basically write letters to each other. I think it pretty much says what it does on the can. And Clyde and his brother have been working on Letterwiki for some time now. They've been building it with a lot of, I think, tender love and care. And they're trying to build a platform that essentially supports all types of different intellectuals and in particular enables and facilitates their communication in a letter format. And as many people might know, writing letters has always been a tradition in scientific communities, in philosophical communities. Writing letters has been around forever, and it's a kind of tried and true technique for various types of intellectuals to communicate and develop their ideas and develop their own communities. But there aren't really too many places online where you can do this in an elegant, useful, and nicely supported way. So I think that's what Clyde and his brother are trying to build. So I wanted to bring them into this series that I'm doing for independent intellectuals to kind of give people a sense of all of the different places that one can share one's work nowadays. There's so many different independent platforms out there for independent intellectuals to get their work out there and develop an audience, but a lot of them don't know where to send their work or how they should think about it, or there's just a lot of uncertainty about how to do that and where one should send their work. So this talk with Clyde is going to be in a series of talks that I'm doing with a bunch of different representatives of different platforms where independent intellectuals can share their work. So this is one in this series, and I think we should just get right after it then. So first of all, thanks a lot, Clyde, for coming out. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Justin. I'm excited to be here.
Cool. Yeah, absolutely. So I think maybe one place we could start is to just give some people some context for the Letterwiki operation. In some ways, people might be interested in Letterwiki also because you and your brother are kind of independent intellectuals in your own right in some regard, and it's always interesting to kind of learn about people's projects and what it kind of looks like under the hood. So maybe you could break down for us some of the key metrics for Letterwiki, like roughly how many users do you have, how many letters are exchanged per, I don't know, month or however you count those things. Give us a kind of snapshot of Letterwiki.
Yeah, sure. I mean, in terms of the numbers, the key things that we track are readers and active writers per week. So, in the last 30 days, we had 17,000 readers and 62,000 page views. And then we've had 27 active writers per week. So those are kind of like the key metrics for us. You sort of touched on total number of letters and so on. I think we have 2,500 total letters. But as I said, like the things that we're actually tracking is like our North Star metric is readers and writers. And that kind of makes sense from a content platform
Right.
perspective, but also from one that has an engine to actually produce a virtuous loop between writers and readers. We want Letter to be a place where writers can come to express their ideas, engage in dialogue, find an audience. And we want readers to come and find uniquely valuable content that they can't access anywhere else online.
Right. Yeah. Do you think that there's a particular type of user that you're most dedicating the development to? Do you have a kind of customer persona or user persona that you think is the kind of ideal use case for Letterwiki?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's people that are courageous, and want to genuinely expose their ideas to the world and think out loud in public, and aren't afraid to be wrong and to change their mind and to tackle contentious issues. So we're seeing a lot of academics who are trying to break out of traditional academia and find a broader audience and figure out ways to translate their ideas for the average curious smart reader. So that's kind of where we focus now. Like, our readership are typically academically interested, but are not going to go and read esoteric papers. They want the content kind of highlighted in a way that they can digest, similarly to a podcast. So in many ways, Letter is like a written podcast. It's got a lot of the benefits of podcasting, but it's also easier to produce content. So you've got two people in dialogue, but you don't need any of the sort of technology. You can just jump online and put your thoughts down in writing. And And because you're doing it that way, there's a bit more breathing room between the exchanges. In this setting now, you and I are talking, I have to come up with my best version of an answer in seconds. In a letter exchange, I get to sort of sit on your questions for an hour or a couple of hours or a few days or weeks even, and then really put my best foot forward. So I think it has a lot of the similarities of podcasts, but a few key advantages as well.
Yeah. Okay. That's an interesting comparison to podcasting and not to other more traditional forms of publishing. It's kind of interesting because I didn't quite think about it that way, but when you compare it to podcasting, that's just a different frame. That's interesting.
Oh, I think that's our central thesis: is that dialogue is uniquely valuable and is underrepresented in the media at large. Why is it that the most popular podcasts are some version of a dialogue between either domain experts or sort of a curious interviewer and an expert? But then when we go on to something like The Atlantic or any of the major publications, they're standalone monologues. And I think there's a legacy angle to this that has just produced that mode of content production. But I think the next wave is going to feature a lot more dialogue, and we think that Letter could be one of the sort of pioneers there.
Right. Very cool. So yeah, do you think, well, first of all, something I wanted to clarify is if someone is wanting to use the platform and write a letter to someone for the first time, there's no editorial control, right? There's no kind of vetting process. Anyone is welcome. Is that right?
Yeah, anyone is welcome to start a conversation with anyone else. What we're doing now with Letter, and from a branding perspective, is really focusing on the highest quality content. So whilst we're receiving 27 active writers per week, of that 27, there's probably 5 or 6 that we will feature on the featured letters page.
Right.
And with feature sets like topics coming up in the next few weeks, we'll be able to really showcase the best content. Right now, I think Letter is the best place to have a written dialogue with someone on the internet, but it's not particularly good for discoverability, which is a significant problem for a content platform. You come into Letter through seeing a share on Twitter of a conversation that you think was interesting. You finish that conversation, and right now we just do a terrible job of actually directing you to other content that you're likely to find compelling. So that's been our focus the last few months.
Okay, interesting. I appreciate your transparency. I mean, in some ways, platforms that are early in their development that have some flaws and that need to be worked on, in some ways, that's a good opportunity for up and coming writers and thinkers, because if you can get in before the platform is really blown up, then it's sometimes like a more attractive and more practical possibility to get in early while things are still being developed.
Exactly. And I guess that's the call to action, really, is that if you are someone who's trying to build an audience and you like the marketplace of ideas and you like being challenged and you like challenging people, then Letter is an ideal space. It's really customized for you. It's tailored to that kind of user.
Right.
And we're very early stages. Whilst we launched the platform in February last year, there really has been tremendous amount of development in the last few months in terms of figuring out like what we actually are. The first few months are really, it's a big experiment, and you're trying to figure out what product market fit might look like. Who is this actually for, and who is it not for, by extension? So yeah, it's been an exciting couple of months, and I think what's coming up next are the key features that are going to allow us to solve that discoverability issue.
Right on. Okay, interesting. I mean, from my perspective on it, it seems to me that, also thinking about my own audience and people who might end up watching this, it seems to me that perhaps Letterwiki is a particularly attractive platform for people who have ideas or commentaries that are particularly related to something that someone else is doing, first of all, because then they obviously become the object of the letter. They become the person to whom you address the letter. That's one criteria that would make me think Letterwiki would be a good platform if your comment or idea is directly related or a response to someone else. But also, if you're having a tough time maybe getting published in other places where you're trying to get published. I mean, the fact of the matter is that all kind of public platforms for publication get a lot of submissions, and they only have so many editors. And it's inevitable that you could be a good writer with real content, share, with real ideas to share. And perhaps you're getting ignored by different types of more traditional publication platforms simply because, you're just falling through the cracks. It doesn't necessarily mean you're not worth it, or you're not a good writer, or your ideas aren't good. It just might not fit their editorial mission. They might just not have enough editors on staff. And also there's just a major element of luck involved with that sort of thing. So it seems like if you're having, both of those two apply, where you're having trouble getting published elsewhere, and it's a particularly kind of dialogical commentary of some kind, then it seems like Letterwiki would really be your best place to go, because no one's going to stop you. No one's checking to see if you're allowed to submit or not. And you can directly address your article to someone. And that just, it feels like that increases the probability of getting some sort of response and engagement, since you're actually not calling someone out in an aggressive way, but you're actually kind of putting the ball in someone else's court to respond.
Yeah, I think actually it's a great insight, given how little you've had to do with the platform, because we've actually just formed that exact relationship with Area Magazine, where
I have written on the platform, mind you. I've done a letter exchange with Alexander Bard, and I quite enjoyed the whole experience. It was cool. I never knew anything about him until he wrote me a letter, and it was, on the whole experience was an edifying, positive experience. So yeah.
I mean, I think the thing that we failed to do for a writer like you was really boost your audience sufficiently to make you a power user, someone who's on Letter like once a fortnight or a couple times a month. That really is a mission for us. So we should be getting writers like yourself on Letter far more regularly than we currently are. So it does highlight where things need to be repaired on the platform. But just to go back to your point about submissions to publications, we've got a formalized arrangement now with Area Magazine where they assess the submissions that they're getting. Obviously, the ones that are sufficiently high quality and relevant get published. But then there are others that they think show promise, but just need a bit more refinement. And they're actually directing people to Letter.
Interesting.
To go and actually, use kind of Letter as like a working layer for that, improving the work before it's ready for publication. So they can go to Letter, they can find an interlocutor. Through that writing process, the actual final piece of content can be improved, and then they can circle back to Area or other publications and say, look, we've actually gone away, taken your feedback on board, and this is the final piece.
Oh, interesting. That's really cool. Yeah. So do you have a sense of particular topics or particular styles of letter writing that play better than others? Any kind of tips or tricks for people who are kind of listening to us and they're like, oh, I'd love to submit. Maybe you could share some insights on what tends to work well or what doesn't work well.
Yeah, if you look at, so currently on Letter in the last few weeks, we've introduced reads to the conversation. So you actually see on the platform how many reads a particular conversation has had.
Okay.
So that's pretty cool, because I think it acts, it has two functions. One is it helps readers figure out what the most popular content is, but it also helps train writers to be able to produce content that is more popular. And the stuff that currently is getting the most reads kind of highlights the point I made earlier about the bravery required. And people don't want to just read the same angles and storylines regurgitated sort of ad nauseum that they can find multiple other places. They really want to see the good faith interlocutors engaged in battle, actually letting the ideas bleed and getting into it, rolling up your sleeves and getting your hands dirty. And I think that it doesn't really matter what the subject matter is, as long as it's a difficult problem for that requires a lot of nuance to arrive at reasonable positions about them. I think something like Twitter is just so tribal now. Every time I'm on there, I'm conscious of either saying something that is going to potentially damage Letter, or just preaching to the choir and speaking to my particular tribe. And it's an echo chamber. It really has become one.
I think many people I talk with have that same feeling, that Twitter is just kind of like that. They can't even get going on it. They can't really do anything on Twitter because they feel paralyzed by precisely that problem. So I guess you kind of see the Letter as possibly a longer form alternative for people who have that kind of blockage.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's where the bulk of our writers are coming from. The people that are trying to use the existing platforms like Twitter to have the nuanced conversation, and realizing how impossible that really is. And the main reason is just because anyone can interject into the conversation. One of the key features of Letter is that whilst the conversations are public, once they're underway, they're locked to those two initial participants. So you and I can view the conversation, but we can't actually participate in it. And I think that is actually really important. It's kind of how conversation functions in the real world. It would be very strange if you and I were having this conversation at a coffee shop and some random member of the public decided to stick their nose into it. But that is kind of what happens every second on Twitter. So yeah, these are simple, subtle features that I think have tremendous impact on the kind of content which gets produced.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I think that's insightful. Now, when people log on to Letterwiki, let's say someone's logging on for the first time, the platform is the basic idea is quite simple, right? You write letters to people and you address them to people, and then they can respond, and Letter provides the kind of interface that facilitates that. Now, do you have a suggestion or a set of best practices for after you write a letter to someone? Are there tips or tricks on how to kind of increase the probability of getting a response? Do folks have some suggestions on that front?
Yeah, so we have some very basic writing tips on the platform. If you click on like this little question mark icon on the top bar, it'll give you like a very brief overview of how to get started. But the thing you're alluding to is what we're currently working on, which is a bit more of a more comprehensive version of that for conversations that are already underway, or for people who know exactly what they want to write about, but I'm not sure exactly what the best way to go about it is.
Well, I just mean, like, are there practices that seem to work well? Like, for instance, I remember when I had never heard of Letterwiki. I think at the time that Alexander Bard wrote me a letter, and he did a few different things to follow up with me. And I probably wouldn't have responded unless he did those few things to follow up with me. Now,
Yeah,
this might be an interesting conversation because a lot of people don't know how to navigate this sort of thing because they don't know what is the line between just following up and then being annoying, right? So, like when Alexander Bard wrote me a letter on Letterwiki, like many busy people, I just kind of ignored it and kind of put it off and put it off. I wasn't against the idea at all. This is how busy people work, right? You just kind of ignore things until someone or something kind of convinces you to deal with it right there, or there's a deadline associated with it or something like that. So, it was kind of interesting. Like, I never knew anything about Alexander Bard. I never knew anything about Letterwiki, so I ignored it for a little bit. But Alexander was slightly annoying in following up with me. I think he tweeted at me a couple times. I think he mentioned me on Facebook a couple times. And so he was slightly annoying, but in retrospect, I'm glad that he followed up. I'm glad that he followed through and was slightly annoying because I enjoyed my letters exchange with him. I enjoyed getting to know him, and now we're contacts, and I appreciate him, and I appreciate having him in my network. So I'm curious, from your perspective, from watching a bunch of these relationships unfold, do you have anything kind of off the cuff that you would suggest about how people should follow up or not?
sure. I mean, there's a couple of different scenarios that, and the strategies that work vary between them. So in certain instances where you've got two kind of, I guess peers is the right word. So they're people that have a similar audience size that are entering into a conversation. A lot of what happens there that's effective is a discussion offline before the conversation actually gets underway. So it's like, I reach out to someone, I might cite a part of their work that I think is worth debating, and then I can outline some kind of rules of engagement. So it could be, I'll take letter one, I'll give you the final word. We'll each write 2 to 3 letters each.
And this is off the site. This is people
This is on email. So there's kind of
negotiating it privately. Okay.
Yeah, it's like a matchmaking process
Okay.
that takes place, and kind of defining the parameters that are going to confine the conversation. And some people, I mean, this is the interesting thing, is that some people are not interested in having any rules. It's like, we'll just start this conversation and it can go anywhere, and it can have, the timeline can be as long as we decide, and we can assess as we go. So there's that approach. But a lot of the times I think it is useful to define what the conversation is going to be centered on, what's the writing commitment for each person, like some rough idea of timeline. So, something that seems to be working quite well, just from general observation on the site, is who will write letter one, who will have the final word, how many letters each. Currently we have 1,000 word limit per letter. I think that's about right. We're open to extending that, and you can publish more than one letter as a single response if you really need to go beyond that. But I think being empathetic to the reading experience, people are busy. No one has time to go and read. We've had letter exchanges that are over 50 letters long in a single conversation. And it's exciting because it shows that there's the conversations bursting out of people, but it's a massive commitment to present to a reader. And you're competing with all the mediums that allow them to consume content whilst they're commuting and so on. So, I personally, as a reader, like conversations that I feel as though I can get through in 20 to 30 minutes of reading at most. And I like the piecemeal aspect of it. So I don't need to read the entire conversation in one sitting. And sometimes that's impossible because the conversation's in real time. So being able to subscribe to follow a conversation, so I'm notified when new letters appear in it, it's actually really useful to me as a reader. I want to be able to follow along, read one piece today, another tomorrow, or another in a few days. And in terms of strategy there with getting responses, one of the things we've run into, which we've realized requires some design on the platform, is some of our higher profile writers, people like Massimo Pigliucci, David Sloan Wilson, Helen Pluckrose, and so on. They're getting unsolicited letters from general members of the public that, frankly, they don't have time to respond to, but they're excited that people are excited about their work, but no one has time to respond to every letter that you receive. So I think getting the message to readers that, as long as people can write letters to high profile writers on Letter, but I think you need to enter into that recognizing it's unlikely you're going to get a response. Right. However, writing a letter to someone like that can create a side conversation with someone else who sees your letter. So there's advantages to doing that. I think the feature that we need to build that is currently under design will allow our highest profile writers to kind of indicate that they're currently not responding to letters, but that they will re-engage at some point in the future, or that there are some ability to kind of flag that you're welcome to write to me. But in the same way that you can't expect an email response from every author you reach out to, letter functions the same way. So.
Right. Although I wonder if you're an independent intellectual and maybe you're not well networked, but you have real ideas or you have real commentary that is real and valuable, and you want to write a letter to someone who's maybe higher profile. In some ways, it's kind of a bragging right to say, like, I disproved Brett Weinstein's paper. And I laid it all out in detail and he never responded. Must mean I'm right. Obviously that's not necessarily true, but in all seriousness, I mean, it's not the end of the world. If you write a high quality letter to someone who's higher profile than you and they never get back to you, you can reframe that a little bit, and at least in your own mind, and to other people. And you can say, look, I showed it. He doesn't respond. He must be a coward. I'm not saying like you should be aggressive like this or mean like this, but there's a little bit of that available, and there might even be a grain of truth to it sometimes. If no one responds to your letter, at least you tried and you laid it out there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is essentially how how open letters function. So an open letter is like a rhetorical statement that is presented as a reaching out to someone to engage in dialogue, but isn't actually something quite different. It's just a statement about them or their work that isn't really an invitation to dialogue. And I think we have open letter functionality on Letter. So you can write an open letter or you can write to someone. What I'd like Letter to represent is a genuine outreach for dialogue. There's plenty of other places like Medium and so on, or blogs that you can just go and put your monologue in on paper. So I don't mind high profile people receiving letters, as long as those letters are a genuine attempt at a conversation. And, just like sending fan mail, you miss 100% of the shots you don't take. I think Richard Dawkins is signed up. He has an account on Letter. And,
nice. I mean, something I would say to people thinking about kind of pursuing some sort of letter strategy and developing their ideas and developing a network and getting a conversation going around a particular project that you're working on. If you want to write letters, I would think that I could think of a few possibly unexplored or unexploited possibilities. I want, maybe you can think of some cases or maybe not, Clyde, but like something that I would think about, for instance, is I probably wouldn't try writing a letter to Richard Dawkins, but you can think of a lot of kind of more moderately, slightly high profile academics who you might think that they're famous, but they're probably not. Like, the fact is, you can be pretty famous, have like a pretty substantial number of Twitter followers, and have a fairly, well-known kind of name recognition. And the fact is, you're not being inundated with letters from people. You're just not. You're not being inundated with email. You're not. You might be busy with your work, but the fact is, like, if you're a moderately famous academic, moderately to medium fame academic, and you get a thoughtful letter from a random person, if it's legit, you're going to respond. Because what a lot of people don't realize is that in academia, there's a real ethical code that you are kind of responsible for responding to thoughtful critics. A lot of people don't know this, but if you get a thoughtful letter by a smart person, even if that person has no credentials, they're complete random Joe Schmo, but the letter is honest and sophisticated and intelligent, and it's a critique or an objection or a question about your academic work, most academics will try their best to respond to it. And I feel like a lot of people maybe don't know that, and Letterwiki might be a great opportunity to test that type of relationship building.
Yeah, I love that line of thinking. And this is actually one of the first things that happened to my brother and I when we were conceptualizing Letter. So we had reached out to fairly famous public intellectuals, actually very famous public intellectuals, and were surprised by the number of them who would reply to emails. And some of those replies were incredibly thoughtful and thorough. And, this struck me as really bizarre that I was the only person benefiting from that exchange. I mean, obviously, they were kind of getting some sort of boost as an educator, but there must be millions of people that had similar questions to me. And the idea that this conversation was locked in private email just seemed insane. Mm-hmm. And that was one of the major reasons why we thought Letter needed to exist. You can reach out to people, and that conversation, high profile people, and that conversation is just orders of magnitude more valuable if other readers can view it. And I think it would only motivate high profile writers to be more thoughtful and spend more time on a reply if they know that instead of one person on the other end of an email receiving it, it's going to be read by tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions of other readers. And that whole concept is just incredibly exciting to me. The other thing it also allows a higher profile writer to do is kind of lower the ladder for a up and comer to climb. And to improve the mobility of another writer, so they don't have to go through these traditional channels to build an audience. One or two conversations with a Richard Dawkins or Sam Harris, or even people that are sit kind of in that middle tier, can really boost a writer's audience significantly. And that's something that we are passionate about at Letter, is allowing people with good ideas to build an audience faster than is currently possible for them.
For sure. Yeah. Do you, I don't want to catch you off guard. You may or may not have memory or data or anything like on this, but I'm curious if you can think of any particularly interesting kind of anecdotes or stories about people who have had success on Letter, maybe just to kind of paint a picture for us of what.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot. I mean,
especially people who kind of start with relatively low profiles or small platforms. Can you think of cases where people have really kind of been able to increase their, because I don't want to make it sound like it's just about networking or like social capital. It's really about kind of intellectual advancement. Like if people are able to, from having no contacts or no networks, to actually be involved in substantial intellectual dialogue with people who are perhaps above them or more advanced than them in some regard.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of various value propositions. It's from a reader's perspective and from a writer's perspective. From a writer's perspective, the few that sort of jump to mind that are relatively recent. If you look at our homepage now, you'll see a conversation between Helen Pluckrose and Kathleen Stock. Now, as far as I know, that conversation has received more reads than any of their individual publications. So any of their individual blogs, any of their individual writings on area or whatnot. And I think that that's exciting because it's highlighting that by entering into dialogue with someone else, you get access to their audience, not just your own. So,
Right.
in some ways, it's like doubling up. So that's one that stands out. Andrea Lewis, who has a podcast, reached out and had a really interesting conversation with Liam Bright on Letter, and as a result, got Jeffrey Sachs on her podcast. So these kind of other network effects taking place, where if you have a really interesting conversation, you can use that as a vehicle to then give you access to someone else on a different medium.
Right.
It's kind of a way to build credibility. You've put the time, effort, and obviously the quality of the writing has to be there. But if it is, these letter exchanges are valuable beyond just the readership. And then we had a really interesting conversation a few months ago between Brian Earp and who was his interlocutor? I forget his interlocutor now. It was a rabbi, but it was about circumcision. And we had readers reach out to us and say that as a result of this conversation, I'm actually changing my mind about what I'm going to do with my when my baby arrives. My wife's pregnant, and this has actually changed. And that's massive. I mean,
For sure.
The fact that some baby's going to be out in the world with all of its anatomy is exciting. The fact that the power of conversation can boil down to that is, and I'm sure there's a lot of stuff that's happened that we don't hear about. I mean, I know that I've engaged in conversation and read conversations on Letter that they are impactful. They actually strike a chord and they can move the needle.
Now, how about this as a tactic? I wonder if anyone's done this. Do people, or could people who have no profile, they've never published anything online before, perhaps, let's assume, but they're buddies, let's say, or they know each other, could they could basically bootstrap their own kind of intellectual dialogue through a series of letters with themselves, possibly, right? So it's like maybe you're not active on Twitter, or you haven't been building an audience for a while, but just maybe one other person somewhere on some internet community who's smart and kind of interested in the same things as you are. You could kind of say to them, hey, neither of us have any followers, but let's plan a letter exchange. We'll do it on Letterwiki, and in that way we can kind of build some energy around the topics that we're interested in together, and kind of bootstrap ourselves into at least some type of visibility and some type of following. Have you ever seen anyone try that, or do you think that could work?
Yeah, I mean, we see a lot of that. There's people that, I mean, you're a PhD and you're just getting out into the world. You can't have developed a huge Twitter following or Facebook following or Instagram following. So you're all starting from scratch. How do you go from 0 to 1? What we're saying is that you get there through dialogue and the quality of your writing and the readability of your writing. There's a difference between academic writing and writing on academic subject matters for the general audience. And I think Letter is a unique way in which to translate ideas that might otherwise be verbose and esoteric for people that are curious about them, but currently don't have a way to actually engage with them. We've seen that already. And one of the other things that we're seeing emerge is this kind of letter slotting into existing conversation spaces. So people having a letter exchange before they appear on a podcast to kind of flesh out what their positions are, work through any initial ambiguity, and it allows for a much more concise, targeted, better signal to noise conversation when they go on the podcast. Or on the flip side of the podcast, we've had this podcast exchange. There's a lot left on the table. We can now move this into a letter exchange, which doesn't require the same sort of in-person to and froing, but I can work on my letter piece by piece over a few months even. So there's a lot there that can be explored and is starting to be explored now, and it's exciting because I think we can add value to spaces that it wasn't obvious to us a few months ago.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. I didn't even think of that. It's like if you're trying to get someone on your podcast and maybe they're not responding to your emails because they're too busy, perhaps, and that you're just not able to get their attention. Maybe you write them a letter, and if it's a good letter and it's got meat on it, then maybe it just gets you through that one extra filter just to make them kind of pay attention, and then you get them on your podcast, maybe.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this played out in the lead up to our YC interview. We had Peter Lindbergh working for us in a matchmaking role, reaching out to people. And the translation or the conversion rates that he had from the reach outs to actually getting people to engage on Letter, not with him, but with other people, was massive. It was so much better than all the rest of us. And it was because he had a pre-existing relationship with them. They'd appeared on his podcast, or he'd done outreaches to them and couldn't get them on his podcast, wrote them a letter, or found the right person to write them a letter. And that's another whole area that we're keen to explore, is this empowering people to manufacture conversations that they are not actually part of. But because that they've got their finger on a pulse of a particular community, they know who's likely to have a really compelling conversation, and they can do the outreach to say, you guys both have interesting things to say on this. I think there's a substantive disagreement here, and it's nuanced. That's the thing. It's like, not to go on a complete tangent here, but there's some very predictable conversations that we've seen and will continue to see on Letter. It's like the left and the right. It's the gun issue, the abortion issues. These conversations are had every day in the world, and they need to keep happening. But the really interesting conversations are where people are values aligned, but disagree on tactics, and they come from within the same community. And figuring out how to navigate forward from that position is really interesting. And I think a written dialogue is a uniquely valuable way to unpack that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Now, do you have any, I don't want to keep you on for too long. I'm curious if you have any other just sort of miscellaneous tips or tricks or do's or don'ts. Like, are there particular mistakes that writers make on Letter? Maybe something they do that just seems correlated with no response or bad conversations, or anything you want to flag?
Yeah, I mean, I think the mistake I see repeated is to utilize the same tactics that are rewarded on other platforms on Letter. So, something like Twitter rewards snark, sort of biting commentary, but you have to keep in mind that on Letter, if you want to progress in any way on the platform, you have to extend an invitation, and you have to have that invitation accepted. So even if you vehemently disagree with someone, your writing to them has to be such that your criticism is focused on the ideas. We all kind of talk about this as almost cliche thing, but we've lost the ability to actually focus on the concepts and on the ideas. And so much of it spills over into the ad hominem, and you get rewarded for that on Twitter. And I see people write letters, and I'm amazed that they expect a response, because they're kind of recapitulating the same tone that they would adopt on something like Twitter and expecting a different response. And I think that's really the only mistake that I've seen.
That's good. That's a good tip, because I think that would not be obvious necessarily. People would feel maybe like they have to employ these tactics that they would use from other platforms in order to get someone's attention, or in order to be splashy or whatever. But you're saying that that's actually not rewarded in how the system works. That's cool. Now, what about when you select letters for the featured page? It sounds like you mentioned that before. That's something that will significantly elevate the view counts and the influence of a particular letter exchange. What are you looking for precisely when you're looking to feature certain letter exchanges?
Yeah, I mean, the main thing is just the quality of the writing and the newsworthiness of the content. And I think the profile of the interlocutors. So these are all factors that we weigh up, and it's a very manual process at this stage. It'll start to become more organic and algorithm driven in future. It's like, we want people that are willing to engage in contentious issues, to do it thoughtfully and in good faith, and to try and find common ground where it can be found. And we've got everything on there from panpsychism to trans rights. So that, it's a broad spectrum at this stage. I think what we'll start to see more of is the current events becoming a higher priority. Now, what's happening in the world right now deserves multiple conversations, and I think we're not doing as good a job as we could be of sort of capturing the moment and using Letter to host conversations that are particularly relevant. It almost seems tone deaf to be pushing content that isn't about the apocalypse right now. It's the world is burning, and to have a conversation about some very esoteric academic subject matter, whilst it's important, I think we need to view Letter more as a place to go and figure out how to navigate life by observing or engaging in conversation. And that's definitely something we're going to be doing in the next few months.
Interesting. Very, very interesting. So I feel like we did a pretty good job here of going over a lot of the main ideas related to Letterwiki and some of the tactical and strategic considerations. So I think this will be pretty useful for people. I'm curious also, before I let you go, maybe we could talk a little bit about, if you want, Letterwiki as a project in its own right, and kind of putting you in the seat of the creator now for a minute. I'm curious how, in the early days, how do you get something like Letterwiki off the ground? Network effects are notoriously hard to engineer, especially at the beginning. So for someone like you and your brother who are interested in intellectual dialogue and improving intellectual culture, really, I'd be curious to hear just a little bit about the origin story of Letterwiki and how you first kind of got that project off the ground.
Yeah, I mean, it's been a long journey for us. We've been working on this project now. This is 5.5 years in for Dane, Monish, and I, the co-founders of the company. But really only from late 2018 do we pivot into the space we're currently in. And we had built technology for a separate project. But then we went out to one of the local universities, and we just asked people, we did a lot of live interviews. We'd buy them a coffee and sit down with them and say, what is it that you love about social media? What is it that you don't like? If you had a magic wand, what kind of changes would you make? And from there, we started to develop the concept that is now Letter. And I took those live interviews into a series of video conversations with people. Helen Pluckrose was instrumental there. I reached out to her through a friend, and she sent us a list of names and said, these are people that I think deserve bigger platforms than they currently have. You should talk to them about what they would like to see on a platform that is designed for long form nuanced dialogue. And what was really interesting about that process was, I think I ended up doing something like 60 interviews, and I would schedule them in for like 30 to 40 minutes, and some of them would go for 3 hours. And the conversation just burst out of people, and the criticism of the existing platforms the floodgates opened, and a lot of those first interview subjects became our early adopters. And I think it was because they got to know the founders, they got to know Dane and I. I think they realized we were values aligned, that we were doing this not to just leverage a consumer internet opportunity to make $1 billion. Right. We're actually, we've got skin in the game. We've been at this now for half a decade. We care deeply about the problem we're trying to solve, and we want to build it for them. Ultimately, the content is only going to be as good as the writers that use it. And
right on.
Our mission is to provide as much value to writers as possible. And I really feel like in the last few months, we're figuring out how to do that. And the next
right on.
I think are going to be particularly exciting.
So that's basically a classic Y Combinator teaching, right? Talk to users all the time, as much as possible.
Yeah, really. Talk to users and build the product. And it took us a long time to realize how spot on that was, and how much we hadn't adhered to it, even though we thought we were. I think, it's a painful lesson, but I'm glad we learned it in the end.
Well, it's interesting because it almost cross applies to what we were talking about before in terms of intellectual strategy, because in some ways what I'm doing with indiethinkers.org is I'm basically trying to cross apply all of the knowledge and wisdom and best practices that have been developed in the startup world, really, and applying that to how intellectuals can build their own models on the internet in complete independence, and how to do that financially in a way that's financially viable. Because I think it's more financially viable now than ever. And so it's kind of interesting because in some ways, what we're talking about, writing letters and the benefits and the virtues of writing letters to people, it actually has a lot of the same kind of tactical and strategic wisdom that talking to users has if you're starting a business in some ways, right? Yeah. Because it's like, if you're developing ideas, if you're doing research in science or philosophy or whatever it might be, like ultimately, if you really want to make progress on that regularly and really advance a long-term research agenda, you have to be talking to people who are doing work in that area also. It's a very similar logic as why startup founders have to talk to users to
Exactly.
realistically develop their product in a way that actually works. So it's interesting. There's a real commonality there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the whole scientific method requires open, constant dialogue and feedback loops and
Right.
iterations. And conversation is such a natural way to do that. It's just that it's the existing platform. Yeah, look, thanks for the chat. I really enjoyed it. I know you can't talk to me, can only type, but we'll have to wrap it there, and hopefully get a chance to talk again in the future. And yeah, really, really enjoyed the conversation. Appreciate the opportunity to talk to your audience.
I think if you're interested in writing for Letter, I hope you found this useful, giving you some background context for what the platform's all about, what they're trying to do, and hopefully we gave you some tips and tricks that actually might help you succeed in using Letter. I genuinely think Letter, I really like what they're trying to do. I really like these founders. I really do think their heart is in absolutely the right place, and pretty much very similar to what I'm trying to do with Indie Thinkers. I think we're both, or all of us, are quite passionately and genuinely interested in pretty much just supporting and facilitating independent intellectual life and allowing a kind of maximal expression and a kind of successful development of ideas in public culture. So I really like what they're doing. I definitely do believe that it's a good platform and opportunity for, especially for independent intellectuals trying to develop intellectual projects over time. I think the kind of intrinsic networking aspect of writing letters is both valuable intellectually, but also socially and tactically in terms of actually developing an audience and building a platform or a profile. And so, yeah, I think we went over some of the types of people who I think would most be able to benefit from writing some letters to people on Letterwiki. People who are, maybe your ideas are a little too marginal for mainstream publications. Consider Letterwiki, because anyone can write on there. Perhaps if you are, especially if your ideas are related to someone in academia or academic literatures, and you have something real to say, then I think targeting kind of sophisticated and maybe mildly influential academics in the field that you're interested in, I think you have a very good chance of getting a response from someone who is a really good scholar in the area that you're genuinely interested in, but maybe they're not super famous. They're not a Richard Dawkins or whatever. I think even if they're at Harvard or they're at NYU or one of these prestigious places, the fact of the matter is, if you have something to say and it's real, most academics are going to be favorable to responding in some way. As I said in the talk, they see it as a kind of public duty. So I think definitely consider giving that a go. It's both intellectually good, but also, good in terms of building a profile and an audience and a network. And yeah, I just basically trying to summarize some of the main ideas that we came up with. And also, I think what Clyde said is important. They're really catering to people who have courage, and courage is really what plays well on the platform, is what they said. So I think members of indiethinkers.org are, should be quite interested in this as a possibility. Also, just starting a kind of letter writing ring, if you will, among maybe you and a few friends. Sounds like it could be a good way to kind of move from a private chat group to a slightly more public platform, where maybe at first there's not going to be that many people paying attention, but you can build a kind of public dialogue in your own semi-public way and let that build over time. And then bring other people into it. I think he gave some good examples of some interesting, unexpected crossovers where, you write a letter to one person, but actually it gets the attention of someone else, and then they want to do your podcast. These types of things. I think for independent intellectuals, you have to just be constantly putting yourself out there, constantly trying to communicate your ideas to different people and finding useful connections, productive connections. So I think what I really like about Letterwiki is, there's no gate. Anyone can submit. It's really free in that regard. And just the way that they're blending kind of social psychology, the social dynamics of, when you receive a letter, it calls for a response in a way that, writing a Medium post or a blog post doesn't necessarily elicit responses. I think this is promising. And, at the end of the day, it's free. You don't have to spend too much time on a letter. I think it's a genuinely promising outlet and and tactic, I think, for a lot of people in my orbit to try writing some letters. Yeah, not to mention it's an honorable form and it's a dignified form, and in some ways it's a lost art. So, I think it's really cool. One day I hope that I have a volume published that's called the collected letters, right? Most great thinkers throughout time have some published volume called collected letters of some kind. So I think that's something to aspire to, and I think Letterwiki is pretty much the only game in town for that. That's the only people that are really trying to develop this with great sophistication. So, yeah, I recommend you give it a go. I hope this helps. I hope that gave you some insight in crafting your letter writing plans. All right. And yeah, of course, if you're interested in indie thinkers, if you'd like to request an invitation, you can totally request an invitation to indiethinkers.org. All you have to do is go to indiethinkers.org/request and feel free. I will, if you request an invitation, I'll jump on a video call with you and get to learn more about what you're doing. And I can tell you more about what I'm doing with Indie Thinkers. All right, folks, later.